If you want to understand politics in the United States, you need to understand that it's all about monopoly. The main goal of US foreign policy is to maintain global dominance with no country powerful enough to challenge US hegemony. This was spelled out famously in 1992 in the Pentagon's so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine. This came a year after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and the US essentially was saying, we are an empire, we dominate the entire world, we do not want any near-peer strategic competitors. But maintaining a monopoly is not just the main goal of US foreign policy. It also helps us to understand domestic politics and the economy of the US. This was spelled out very clearly by one of the most powerful billionaires in Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is a close ally of Donald Trump, and he helped to fund Trump's first campaign to be US president. Thiel was a co-founder of the powerful US corporation Palantir, which has been given a lot of contracts by the Trump administration, including Trump is using Palantir to spy on Americans, to make a massive database with information about average Americans. Peter Thiel was also the boss of current US Vice President JD Vance. Vance worked for Thiel, and then when Vance ran for Senate, Thiel funded his campaign with millions and millions of dollars in campaign contributions. And as a big tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel is a proud defender of monopolies. He even wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal defending monopolies. The piece was titled, "Competition is for Losers." This billionaire capitalist and Republican Party megadonor proudly wrote, quote, "Capitalism and competition are opposites. Capitalism is premised on the accumulation of capital, but under perfect competition, all profits get competed away. The lesson for entrepreneurs is clear," end quote. And that lesson is that all entrepreneurs want to build monopolies. They don't actually want competition. Peter Thiel was invited to Stanford University to give a lecture in defense of monopolies, and the host who invited Thiel and introduced him was another billionaire big tech CEO from Silicon Valley, Sam Altman. Altman is the CEO of the powerful artificial intelligence corporation OpenAI. Listen to these two American big tech CEOs praise monopolies at one of the most elite universities in the US.
I have a single idée fixe that I'm completely obsessed with on the business side, which is that if you're starting a company, if you're the founder, entrepreneur starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly, and you want to always avoid competition. And so, hence, competition is for losers. Something we'll be talking about today.
If you understand how these American corporate monopolists think and what motivates them, it goes a long way to help you understand not only the US economy, but US politics, and in particular, the new Cold War that the United States is waging against China. It is now openly admitted in Washington that the US is waging a new Cold War. This is not just my opinion. You could call it the Second Cold War or Cold War II. And it is also widely admitted that a key part of Cold War II is a tech war that the United States is waging on China. The US government has imposed many measures to prevent China from developing technologically. Today I will discuss how the US government has imposed export restrictions to try to prevent China from getting access to the most cutting-edge semiconductors or chips to prevent China from developing advanced AI technology. Washington has also imposed sanctions and tariffs on China, and this is not just Trump, but also Joe Biden. Both Trump and Biden have tried to ban Chinese technological competitors in order to protect US corporate monopolies, especially big tech monopolies in Silicon Valley. Today, I will analyze the evidence and show how protecting monopolies is at the heart of the US economic and political system. Now, a perfect example of how this system works is Uber, the ride-hailing app. Uber symbolizes the Silicon Valley business model, which is all about establishing a monopoly. You see, for most of its history, Uber was not profitable. It was losing money every year, but its business model was to continue to lose money, taking on debt and venture capital investments while it was establishing a monopoly. So Uber was putting all of its competitors out of business. In particular, Uber was obsessed with trying to destroy the unionized taxi industry, the old yellow cabs, which in many major cities like New York City and Chicago, they had powerful unions. So Uber spent lots and lots of money lobbying politicians, working with the government to create laws and policies that benefited it to help it establish a monopoly and put out of business basically all of its competitors. Until now, it is very close to essentially being a monopoly. And I think this was described very well by the technology website CTech. They described Uber's path to profit as a victory of politics over innovation. Here is how they described Uber's business model, which is a good summary of Silicon Valley as a whole. Quote, Uber's success is not the result of technological breakthroughs or smarter resource allocation, nor does it operate in a truly competitive market. Instead, it has mastered the art of engineering a regulatory reality that allows it to circumvent laws, increase its revenue share at the expense of drivers and consumers, and maintain its power through capital and political influence. To achieve profitability, Uber did not improve service or streamline its operations. Rather, it maximized profits from drivers and couriers while cutting every cost unrelated to its core business of ride-hailing and food delivery. It abandoned any pretense of being a technology company. It significantly reduced investment in research and development. It leveraged its dominance and control over drivers' working conditions to take a larger cut of their earnings. From 2019 to mid-2022, the average fare jumped by 63%. Meanwhile, drivers have not seen their earnings rise. In fact, the opposite has occurred. From late 2019 to the end of 2024, it increased its commission rate from 20.7% to 27.1%. This is the business model of large US corporations. It's not to provide a better good or service. It's not to innovate. It's to crush all competition, establish a monopoly, and then hike up the prices of everything, charging monopoly rents, extracting rents from your customer base because they really have no other realistic alternatives. They've all been destroyed. Now, if you've ever used Uber in the US, you know that a few years ago, Uber was very cheap. It was much cheaper than the unionized old school yellow taxis, which is why so many people used Uber, because Uber was rolling over its debt thanks to low interest rates set by the US Federal Reserve, thanks to venture capital infusions. It was able to operate at a loss because investors knew that eventually it would establish a monopoly, so they were willing to accept losses for a few years, and Uber became extremely competitive. It crushed all of its competitors who could not operate at a loss. They had to at least provide livable wages for the taxi drivers. Uber has no responsibilities for its drivers. It takes this rent from these drivers. It doesn't give them healthcare. It doesn't give them any benefits. And finally, after it established a monopoly, Uber was able to massively hike up prices, and now it's profitable. This is Silicon Valley's business model. And we should be clear here that Uber did not just do this on its own. Uber worked hand in glove with the US government, including both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, some top officials from the Barack Obama administration, after Obama left office, what did they do? They went to work for Uber, lobbying for Uber, allowing this corporation to establish this massive monopoly. And regardless of whichever figurehead wins US elections, it's always the large corporations in the US that actually win elections. They're the ones who fund politicians. And a great example of this is in the Donald Trump administration, there are a dozen billionaires, and Trump's attorney general, Pam Bondi, who's the head of the US Justice Department, you know what she was doing before? She was a corporate lobbyist. And can you guess which corporations she lobbied for? Uber was one of them, along with Amazon, one of the biggest monopolies in world history, and GM and foreign countries, including the monarchy of Qatar. This is how extremely corrupt US politics is. And under Pam Bondi's leadership, can you guess what the Justice Department is doing? It is opposing anti-monopoly investigations. In the US, these are referred to as antitrust cases. And as Reuters put it, Trump's antitrust enforcers get out of the way of multi-billion-dollar deals. This report details how Trump's DOJ under Pam Bondi is allowing massive corporations to buy up their competitors in these huge mergers and acquisitions deals. In fact, in July, the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump's DOJ had fired top anti-monopoly officials. This article stated, quote, "The Justice Department has fired two of its most senior antitrust enforcers after internal disagreements over how much discretion their division should have to police mergers and other business conduct that threaten competition," end quote. It noted that this followed weeks of debate over negotiations to defuse a Justice Department lawsuit against HP, Hewlett-Packard. The Wall Street Journal pointed out that, quote, "Part of the feud stemmed from the involvement of outside lawyers hired by HP who weren't antitrust specialists, but were brought in for their connections to administration officials," end quote. So in short, Trump's DOJ fired anti-monopoly specialists with many, many years of experience after a feud involving US anti-monopoly investigations against HP, and HP hired corporate lawyers who did not have a background in antitrust, that is anti-monopoly expertise, but they were linked to Donald Trump administration officials, and they were involved in this feud that pushed out leading anti-monopoly experts. This is just straight up corruption. There's no other word for it. Corruption. And this is how politics in Washington works. It's pay to play. Large corporations control the political system, and there's no limit to the amount of money they can give in so-called campaign contributions, which would be considered bribery in many other countries. But it's totally legal in the US thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, Citizens United, that opened the floodgates of money in politics. And now, in Donald Trump's second term, what is he doing? He's opposing antitrust, that is anti-monopoly investigations. A report from the watchdog group Public Citizen noted that in his first 6 months in his second term, the Trump administration has withdrawn or halted enforcement actions against 165 corporations. And 1/4 of those corporations that have benefited have been from the technology sector, big tech companies. This report noted that the Trump administration has halted or withdrawn 1/3 of targeted investigations into suspected misconduct and enforcement actions against technology corporations. Meanwhile, these big tech companies, along with their executives and investors, spent $1.2 billion on political influence during and since the 2024 elections, including $863 million in political spending, $222 million in payments to Trump's businesses, $76 million in lobbying spending, and $25 million in donations to Trump's inauguration. And let's not forget that at Trump's inauguration in January, he invited some of the most powerful big tech billionaires on earth, some of the richest people on earth, including Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, and then also the CEO of Alphabet, which owns Google, Sundar Pichai, and also the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, who donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration. And in August, Tim Cook was invited to the White House for a meeting with Trump, and the Apple CEO gifted Trump a Made in USA plaque with 24 karat gold. So again, this is how US politics works. This is how the so-called great American democracy actually works. It's an oligarchy. It's a plutocracy controlled by money and large corporations. Now, some defenders of Trump would claim that actually he's been fighting back against big tech corporations, largely because when he lost the 2020 election, he blamed big tech corporations. It's because he has a personal grudge against some of these big tech companies, especially Facebook. But you have to look at what Trump is actually doing now that he's president, not just his rhetoric. If you look past Trump's words, you can see that he's doing basically everything that these big tech corporations want, which is why they all donated millions of dollars to his inauguration. It's why Trump invited them, including Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook. He sat at the inauguration with Trump's cabinet, with the top officials in Trump's administration. Trump was making it clear symbolically to the entire world that his priorities are serving the interests of large corporate monopolies. And this is precisely why the Trump administration is not only opposing many antitrust investigations, but also the Trump administration is giving a green light to corporate crimes. I'm not exaggerating. As Reuters put it, the FBI was ordered by Trump to prioritize immigration as the DOJ scales back white-collar cases. White-collar crime refers to corporate crime. If you're a financier or a banker in Wall Street, if you're a big tech CEO in Silicon Valley, the Trump administration is giving you green light to commit crimes with impunity. So in other words, the Trump administration is focusing on prosecuting some of the weakest, poorest people in the United States, undocumented immigrants who are simply looking for a job to feed their families. They're often paid below the minimum wage. They often have their wages stolen by corporations. They're exploited. These are the most vulnerable people in society. Trump is going after them with tons and tons of resources, spending billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Trump is telling the richest, most powerful people in society, corporate oligarchs, we are not going to go after you. You can commit crimes. You can exploit people and steal from them. And you have 2 thumbs up from the US government. Again, this says so much about the priorities in Washington. The Wall Street Journal reported the same in an article titled, "Trump Administration Retreats from White-Collar Criminal Enforcement." I'm reading here from the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The Trump administration is retreating from some types of white-collar law enforcement, including cases involving foreign bribery, public corruption, money laundering, and crypto markets. In some cases, the administration is effectively redefining what business conduct constitutes a crime." I mean, it almost feels like a farce. The perfect example of this is that in February, less than a month after Trump returned to the White House, he issued an executive order that essentially gives a green light to bribery. This Trump order complained about a 1977 law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was passed by the US Congress in order to oppose bribery and corruption. The Trump White House complained that this anti-corruption law, quote, harms the interests of the United States, end quote. The White House wrote that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement against American citizens and businesses for routine business practices in other nations. They're talking about bribery and corruption. They complain that this, quote, actively harms American economic competitiveness and therefore national security, end quote. So essentially what the Trump administration is saying is they're going to allow US corporations to bribe people in order to win contracts and favorable business opportunities. And as the Trump White House put it, this will, quote, eliminate excessive barriers to American commerce abroad, end quote. This is as blatant as the US government will ever be in saying, yeah, we support bribery, we support corruption, as long as it benefits US corporate monopolies. Because according to the White House, what is good for US corporate monopolies is what's good for US so-called national security. And in particular, this White House executive order made it clear that, quote, American national security depends in substantial part on the United States and its companies gaining strategic business advantages, whether in critical minerals, deep water ports, or other key infrastructure or assets, end quote. So what the Trump White House is saying, pretty obviously, is that they're giving a green light to US corporations to bribe foreign government officials in order to buy up foreign critical minerals and to buy up foreign infrastructure like ports. And Trump has made it clear that this is a main priority of his administration. In particular, Trump is obsessed with trying to colonize Greenland, Canada, and Gaza, and the Panama Canal.
And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
And Trump, in fact, boasted of how he helped one of the most powerful corporations on earth, BlackRock, the Wall Street giant that is the largest asset manager on the planet. Trump boasted that he helped BlackRock buy up ports on both sides of the Panama Canal.
To further enhance our national security, my administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal, and we've already started doing it. Just today, a large American company announced they are buying both ports around the Panama Canal and lots of other things having to do with the Panama Canal and a couple of other canals.
Now, since this deal was announced in March, it may have fallen apart. It's still unclear. But regardless, the point is that the CEO of BlackRock, the Wall Street billionaire Larry Fink, personally called Trump and they talked about this deal, and Trump gave his approval for BlackRock to buy up this foreign infrastructure. So this is the priority of the US government, is allowing bribery and corruption to incentivize big corporations on Wall Street to buy up foreign infrastructure on behalf of the US empire. Again, it's just, the corruption is mind-blowing. It is next level. But as I'm emphasizing, the corruption is part of the system. This is not just about Donald Trump as an individual. This is how the US capitalist system works. And it's how the US political system works, because money controls US politics. And this brings me to the new Cold War that the United States is waging against China. The US government is obsessed with trying to prevent Chinese companies from competing with US corporate monopolies. US monopolies, especially big tech corporations in Silicon Valley, are very afraid of competition from Chinese companies, which is why, for instance, it was reported by the Washington Post that Facebook paid huge contracts to Republican Party lobbying groups and marketing companies in order to malign TikTok, to spread propaganda and disinformation against TikTok, because Facebook, which is owned by Meta, run by the billionaire oligarch Mark Zuckerberg, they see TikTok as a major threat to their control over not only social media in the US, but around the world. So they are obsessed with trying to ban TikTok. And as I stressed earlier, this is not just Trump and the Republicans. It's also the Democrats. Let's not forget that Joe Biden, the Democrat, when he was president, he signed into law a bipartisan act that called for banning TikTok as a so-called national security threat, which is a great excuse for banning one of the main competitors to US big tech corporations. And keep in mind that when Biden signed this law, he said, well, we will allow TikTok to operate in the US only under the condition that the Chinese parent company of TikTok sells it to a US big tech corporate monopoly. Now, Donald Trump, when he entered his second term, he did issue a temporary extension of this policy, allowing TikTok to operate in the US, but not because he's opposed to corporate monopolies. On the contrary, Trump is trying to work out a deal to sell TikTok to US corporations. In fact, Trump boasted that he has a group of, quote, very wealthy people, end quote, who want to buy TikTok. So this is the US government's preferred alternative to having Chinese competitors, is having US corporations buy them all up. And US big tech corporations are also especially concerned about Chinese artificial intelligence competitors. So we now see that US AI corporations are lobbying the government to ban Chinese competitors. A good example of this is Sam Altman, the billionaire oligarch who's the CEO of OpenAI. probably the most powerful and influential US AI corporation. It runs ChatGPT. And Sam Altman is openly calling for the US government to ban DeepSeek, which is the major Chinese competitor. And he claims that DeepSeek is a so-called national security threat because he falsely claims that it's controlled by the Chinese government. That's not true. Now, don't forget that Sam Altman invited the other big tech billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel to Stanford University to give a lecture in defense of monopoly. So both of these oligarchs from Silicon Valley are opposed to competition. They proudly admit that they want monopolies. That's their business model. And then just a few hours after Trump's inauguration, he invited Sam Altman and other big tech billionaire CEOs to the White House, where they announced the so-called Stargate project. This is a US government-backed project pledging supposedly $500 billion of investment to develop AI technology. So this was the perfect symbol of how Silicon Valley is closely linked to the US government. This is not the so-called free market. These are not entrepreneurs who are picking themselves up by their bootstraps. And yet Sam Altman has the gall to claim that China's AI company DeepSeek is state-controlled. It's all managed by the People's Republic of China. Well, he's having meetings with Donald Trump at the White House. So this is not about so-called national security. This is about destroying all competitors to Silicon Valley monopolies. And this is why numerous state governments in the US have restricted DeepSeek. This includes the US states of Texas, New York, Virginia, Iowa, South Dakota, North Carolina, Nebraska, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Alabama, Kansas, and Georgia, and more bans are coming very soon. Meanwhile, more American big tech CEOs are lobbying the US government to impose even more restrictions on China to prevent China from competing with them. Another great example of this is Dario Amodei, who is the CEO of Anthropic. Anthropic is probably the second most powerful AI company in the US after OpenAI. One of the big investors in Anthropic is Amazon, another huge big tech monopoly. Anthropic is also backed by Apple, one of the most powerful tech corporations on Earth. It, until recently, was the most valuable company on Earth by market capitalization, although it was surpassed by Nvidia. But anyway, the point is that the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in which he asked Donald Trump to impose even further restrictions on China to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced semiconductors or chips, to prevent China from developing AI that would compete with his company. Dario Amodei also published a blog post at his website where he complained about the emergence of DeepSeek, and he noted that this Chinese company was able to develop AI models at a lower cost that are similar in performance to US models. He didn't mention that they're also open source, unlike the proprietary monopolistic US models. And in this article, he said that the emergence of Chinese competitors makes the need for export control policies even more existentially important. So obviously, this guy, as the CEO of Anthropic, has a vested interest in pushing the US government to ban his competitors. But he also made it clear that this is not just economically motivated. There are political intentions. And in this article, the CEO of Anthropic wrote that the US needs to prevent China from developing AI in order to maintain a unipolar world. So not only an economic monopoly, but a political monopoly on the entire world. So the US empire can control every region of the world. This is what this Silicon Valley CEO wrote on his website. Quote, "The question is whether China will also be able to get millions of chips. If they can, we will live in a bipolar world where both the US and China have powerful AI models. If China cannot get millions of chips, we'll at least temporarily live in a unipolar world where only the US and its allies have these models," end quote. And of course, he wants to live in a unipolar world. That's why he's advocating for even more aggressive export restrictions on China. He concluded this article imploring the Donald Trump administration that, quote, well-enforced export controls are the only thing that can prevent China from getting millions of chips and are therefore the most important determinant of whether we end up in a unipolar or bipolar world, end quote. So I'm not exaggerating in any way when I say that the goal of the United States and the big tech oligarchs who help to control the political system through flooding the political system with money and buying off politicians, I'm not exaggerating when I say that their goal is to maintain global domination, a political monopoly of the US empire across the entire world. And again, I need to emphasize that this is not just Trump and the Republicans. It's also the Democrats. This is bipartisan in Washington. Let's not forget that the Joe Biden administration also imposed significant export restrictions and tariffs on China and waged this trade war and tech war. So yes, Trump started the trade war on China during his first term as president back in 2018. But when Biden came in, not only did he continue Trump's policies, he actually expanded Trump's policies, and Biden put more and more restrictive export restrictions on China to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced chips to try to stop China from developing AI competitors. In fact, Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, said the quiet part loud. She admitted the goal. She said what the US and its allies were trying to do was, quote, slow down China's rate of innovation, end quote. And then at another event, the Biden administration's Commerce Secretary said that the US government would, quote, do whatever it takes, end quote, to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technologies. I also mentioned how it's become bipartisan in Washington to weaponize trade. And we've seen this under Trump, of course, who's imposed tariffs on countries all around the world. And he's using tariffs as a political weapon to meddle in the affairs of countries like Brazil or India, especially targeting BRICS countries. But Biden also used tariffs as a form of economic war against China. In 2024, the Biden White House imposed sky-high tariffs on numerous cutting-edge technology sectors in China. And he claimed that this was about protecting American workers and businesses, with an emphasis on businesses, especially corporate monopolies. Biden put 50% tariffs on Chinese semiconductors and 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, or EVs. By the way, this came just a few months after Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire oligarch, complained that if the US government did not put tariffs and restrictions on Chinese EV makers, then they would demolish rivals like his company, Tesla. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, though. And Musk, by the way, is especially scared of China's leading EV maker, BYD, which has overtaken Tesla as the world's leading seller of electric vehicles. So again, the Biden White House put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. It also put 25% tariffs on Chinese batteries and battery parts. And even though 25% doesn't sound like a lot compared to 100%, given how batteries are much cheaper than a big product like a car, a 25% tariff on Chinese batteries makes them completely uncompetitive and gives an advantage to US corporations. And then finally, the Biden White House put a 50% tariff on Chinese solar panels to help the US solar industry. So again, what is obvious is that this new Cold War on China is completely bipartisan in the US. And what we can see is that one of the main goals of US imperialism is to maintain these corporate monopolies so no other countries can compete with the US. This is how imperialism works as a global system. The wealthy capitalist economies in the West, in the global North, which colonize the vast majority of the world, use their control over international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and they use the legal system that they helped create in order to maintain monopolies over advanced technologies, controlling intellectual property rights. And they want to keep the poor, formerly colonized countries in the global South trapped in dependency so they can exploit the cheap labor and natural resources of the global South and prevent them from developing their own advanced indigenous industries, especially in the high-tech sector that could potentially challenge Western and in particular US corporate monopolies. And if you think about the global industrial structure or the value chain as a pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the very labor-intensive industries doing things like processing food and making low-value added products like t-shirts and tennis shoes. And then as you go up this pyramid, you get to more advanced forms of industrial manufacturing that are more capital-intensive and less labor-intensive. Workers are paid much higher wages. They tend to work in better conditions. And the companies in these sectors receive higher profits because they're not competing with dozens of countries around the world. Pretty much every country can have a textile industry making t-shirts. Not that many countries can make cars and computers and semiconductors. So the rich capitalist countries at the top of the global value chain, especially the US, but also Europe, Japan, South Korea, they want to monopolize this high-tech manufacturing through control over intellectual property. And the only formally colonized country from the global south that has been able to move up the global value chain in this way, right up to the top of the pyramid, is China. It's the only country that can actually challenge US corporate monopolies in the most advanced sectors, like AI, like quantum computing, like electric vehicles. And this is exactly why the US government, under both Democrats and Republicans, has been trying to restrict Chinese competitors. Because the reality is that the US empire never thought that China would develop as rapidly and as impressively as it has. Imperial strategists in Washington, when they normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, they spent 2 decades refusing to recognize China. And finally, they did normalize relations with China and try to ally together against the Soviet Union during the First Cold War. And then after the First Cold War ended, the strategy of the US was to allow US corporations to offshore their production to China to exploit lower paid workers in China. But they thought that the system would always stay that way, that China would never catch up to the US. As I often say, the US wanted to keep China trapped at the bottom of the global value chain, only producing low value added cheap consumer goods like t-shirts and toys and toasters for Western consumers to help keep inflation low in the West, especially in the US, when wages were completely stagnant ever since the 1970s. So this is why the US allowed China to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001. This is why the US allowed its companies to open factories in China. They wanted China to always remain subordinate on the bottom, and US corporate monopolies would stay on top. Now, dependency theorists have been talking about this for many years, but surprisingly, in March 2025, US Vice President JD Vance delivered a speech at a venture capitalist conference in which he said the quiet part loud. He admitted that when the US normalized relations with China, the idea was that China would always remain subservient and that US companies like Apple would design advanced technologies such as the iPhone, and Chinese workers would physically manufacture the iPhone, but the intellectual property would be controlled by US companies, and the vast majority of the profits would flow to US companies, not to the Chinese workers or Chinese companies. They certainly didn't want Chinese competitors. This was always the strategy, but it didn't work out as they thought it would. Listen to this very revealing admission.
The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now, the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends.
So this is what truly motivates US political and economic policy, is trying to maintain these global monopolies. But of course, other countries also want to develop. They want to lift their people out of poverty, and they want to develop their own local industries and technology. And in particular, the Chinese government has used state-led development and industrial policy to rapidly develop and move up the value chain in the most advanced technological sectors. Now, every 5 years, the Communist Party of China issues a 5-year plan targeting specific industries to develop new technologies. But there was a special plan that was announced in 2015 called Made in China 2025, and it targeted 10 advanced sectors for high-tech manufacturing and development, including new information technology, high-end machine tools and robots, aerospace equipment, ocean engineering equipment, high-end rail transportation, new energy cars, that is electric vehicles, electrical equipment, farming machines, new materials such as polymers, and biomedicine and high-end medical equipment. And here we are today in 2025, a decade has passed, and was China successful? Well, Bloomberg published a report at the end of 2024 concluding that China met nearly all of its goals. According to Bloomberg, China is now the global leader in unmanned aerial vehicles, that is drones, solar panels, graphene, high-speed rail, and electric vehicles and lithium batteries. And it estimates that by 2030, China will be the global leader in carriers of LNG, liquefied natural gas. It also noted that China is now globally competitive in manufacturing drugs, medicines, large tractors, machine tools, robots, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors. The only area where China is not yet globally competitive is commercial aircraft. Now, the world's civilian aircraft industry is dominated by two companies, one US monopoly and one European monopoly. The US company is Boeing, which is obviously very notorious. It has caused so many safety problems in recent years that have led to horrible tragedies. The European company is Airbus. However, China is very rapidly developing an alternative to this global duopoly with its own civilian aircraft company called Comac, and the CEO of Airbus warned that very soon Comac could become a serious rival and disrupt this duopoly. So can you guess what the US government is doing? US politicians are already lobbying to ban Comac, and they're trying to pressure other countries, including companies in other countries, to boycott these Chinese planes, claiming that they're supposedly a national security threat because Comac, unlike Boeing and Airbus, Comac is a state-owned company. So they say, ooh, scary socialism, don't buy any Chinese planes. In fact, the largest airline in Europe, which is called Ryanair, it's based in Ireland, its CEO announced that they're looking into buying planes from China's Comac. So the US government freaked out, and US politicians are now threatening this European company to not buy these Chinese planes. By the way, Ryanair does not even fly to the United States. The US should have nothing to do with a European company that doesn't go to the US. This is not the business of anyone in Washington, and yet US politicians are freaking out. And I have to give credit to the CEO of this Irish company, Ryanair, because he was obviously very angry and taken aback at this US pressure. So you know what he said in response? He said they're thinking about canceling a big order of planes from Boeing, especially because Trump's tariffs threaten to massively increase the cost of these Boeing planes. So first of all, Boeing planes are notoriously dangerous and unreliable. Second of all, they're more expensive. So why would these European companies spend more for worse products when they can buy products from China? This is exactly why the US government is threatening countries and companies around the world to protect US corporate monopolies. And I need to talk a little bit more about Boeing because this company is the perfect symbol of everything wrong with the US economy and the US political system. Now, Boeing used to be respected around the world for making safe, good quality planes. So what happened? Well, CNN actually published a very good report about this that explains. It noted that after the end of the First Cold War, Pentagon contractors began to merge together and form these huge corporations. And Boeing in 1997 merged with competitor McDonnell Douglas. And this report noted that, quote, before the merger, Boeing had a reputation as a company run by people with engineering backgrounds who cared about quality and safety first. But critics say the merger put the company in the hands of executives with a finance background who put profits as their top goal, end quote. An analyst said that after the merger, quote, everything had to be cost justified, end quote. So they cut corners, they cut spending on safety and research and development. And this report noted that many of the leadership ranks in Boeing were filled by veterans of McDonnell Douglas, not Boeing. And I'm reading here, quote, many of them had financial backgrounds, not the engineering backgrounds of those who had run Boeing in the past. Or they came from outside of the company, such as General Electric, GE, where cost-cutting and improved efficiency was a near religion, end quote. So in other words, Boeing was previously run by engineers. It was then taken over by a bunch of paper-pushing finance bros from Wall Street, and they're running the company into the ground, which is exactly what happened to GE. GE originally started as a manufacturing-oriented company, and then its infamous CEO Jack Welch also ran GE into the ground. He basically turned it into a financial firm on Wall Street. He even started buying up media outlets. They abandoned manufacturing, what they originally had been known for, and became yet another Wall Street-style financial firm. And all they cared about was profit. And he constantly laid off workers. He ran the company with a reign of terror. His workers were constantly afraid of him. They were all yes men. He cut corners on everything. He stopped investing in research and development. And the company was run into the ground. But the shareholders made lots and lots of money, which is all that matters to Wall Street. This is their business model. So would it surprise you to learn that Boeing has been doing exactly the same thing? So when Boeing started having major quality and safety problems, it was also when the corporate leadership started attacking the unionized workers. And what did they do? They created a new non-union plant in the so-called right-to-work state of South Carolina, building a factory to make the new most advanced jet at the time, the 780 Dreamliner. And CNN noted that they wanted to create a factory in a state with lower pay where workers did not have as many rights and benefits and they could not go on strike. And surprise, surprise, they cut corners. Their workers were not as well trained and skilled. They did not have as good compensation and benefits, and they made much worse planes. And Boeing started to have major quality control issues at that South Carolina plant, building the 787 Dreamliners that were unsafe. But they didn't care because all they're concerned about is maximizing profit and shareholder returns. In fact, Boeing's leadership closed down the unionized factory in Washington and kept open the non-unionized South Carolina plant. And by the way, the CEO of Boeing during this time, from 2020 until 2024, who oversaw all of these crises, can you guess what his background was? Dave Calhoun was the CEO. He had no engineering background, but he was a finance bro from Wall Street. He previously worked in private equity at the Wall Street giant Blackstone. And before that, he worked at GE, the exact same company I was talking about that was run into the ground based on the same MBA, finance bro, Wall Street business model, which is based on buying back your own shares, paying out fat dividends to wealthy shareholders, no longer investing, not actually innovating, not creating any good products that customers actually want, that are safe. No, this was the Jack Welch business model. The financial website Barron's published a good article that details how Boeing is now paying for decisions it made a decade ago. It shows how the European competitor Airbus spends twice as much on R&D, research and development, compared to Boeing when you look at their overall percentage of their sales. So Boeing stopped investing in R&D. What did Boeing do with its revenue instead? It plowed its revenue into buying back its own shares to pump up the stock price on Wall Street, to make their wealthy shareholders happy. Barron's pointed out that Boeing spends significantly more on shareholder-related spending than Airbus does. From 2014 to 2024, Boeing spent $59 billion returning cash to shareholders, including $20 billion in dividends and $39 billion on share repurchases. Airbus, in the same 10-year period, did not buy back any of its own stock, and it only spent $10 billion paying out dividends. That is 1/6 of what Boeing spent on pushing up its stock on Wall Street. So this is the Wall Street business model. I talked about the Silicon Valley business model based on destroying all of your competitors and making a monopoly. Well, the Wall Street business model is not that different. It's also based on monopolies, and it's based on private equity companies buying up existing companies and destroying them, selling them for parts. I mean, you now even have prosecutors and legal experts in the US warning that private equity is looting the country. It's destroying the country. This is what happened to US companies like Red Lobster, which was bought up by private equity, which sold it for parts and completely destroyed it. Red Lobster is now bankrupt. This is also what private equity bros from Wall Street did to Toys R Us. They bought it up, sold it for parts, destroyed it. It no longer exists. And now private equity vultures are doing the exact same thing to the book publishing company, Simon & Schuster. This is what the US economy is built on, is corporate raiding, asset stripping, and monopolies, destroying all competition so capitalist oligarchs on Wall Street can buy up all of the assets, charge monopoly rents, asset strip existing companies. They don't innovate. They don't invest in research and development. This is the future that the US sees for itself and the rest of the world. And this ultimately is what motivates the US empire's new Cold War on China. It wants to crush China, overthrow the Chinese government, like what the US did to Russia in the 1990s after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. US corporations privatized all of Russia's assets. They sold them off for pennies on the dollar to corporate oligarchs. This is what US capitalist oligarchs want to do to China, to sell off all of its assets, all of its state-owned enterprises, to sell off its private companies as well, to establish monopolies so Wall Street and Silicon Valley have no competitors anywhere else in the world. This is the US empire's strategy. And if you understand that, it will go a long way to help you understand US politics and the US economy. And if you want to learn more about these issues, make sure you subscribe here to our work at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. Leave a comment below. Maybe you disagree with me. Well, share your thoughts below. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.